Klassen, good morning.
Good morning.
Author and illustrator of New York Times bestseller, I Want My Hat Back, and his new book, This Is Not My Hat, which we love. It's our best of the month pick this month.
Yeah, I saw that. Thank you very much.
I'm a huge fan of you. And you're going to draw for us a potential lost illustration from This Is Not My Hat.
Sure, I can give that a try.
Okay, great. So I wanted to ask you about in I Want My Hat Back, the end has what they called it a subversive risk, and then you did a similar thing this time. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, I didn't think it was when I wrote it, and then I thought it was pretty direct. I mean, a lot of animals get eaten in old stories and things like that, and actually getting eaten is sort of an abstract way of killing somebody, and I guess that was the subversive thing. But when we showed it to people, they wanted if we could change the ending to having the rabbit get beat up or something instead of get eaten, and I thought that was way worse than having, just something to get abstractly eaten. But also I wanted to include, since the book is sort of written very simply and as a reader book, I wanted to get it done so that it was, for younger kids, they would at least see the bear getting his hat back, and they wouldn't necessarily know what happened to the rabbit, but as they got older and better able to read what had actually happened, then they would sort of grow into the idea and get it there. So I was hoping we wouldn't scare kids too badly with it, and even, especially since we don't show anything. But with this one, since we did have some trouble, it wasn't a reaction to that, I guess, but I wanted to make it even more vague what happened, and so anybody who did think that something awful happened, it was really their call, and so you can't really yell at me that way. But it was also really fun to just sort of, I love implying things as much as I can just with these, because picture books are so good at that. Pictures and the words together, you can, down the middle between the two things, you can imply so much, and so the ending is very much implied with this one.
I've had, as I've given this book to people, they will come back to me and say, does he get eaten? Does the fish get eaten? Is he still in the weeds?
I've been asking kids, and their opinion is largely that he does get eaten. Although the first review I read, I can't remember where I read it, but it was a parent who I'm not sure was a fan of the first one, said this book is great because they worked it out behind the weeds. They talked it out, and he got his hat back, and that was all that happened. And you don't see what happens, so if that's what they need to know, then yeah, that's what happens. I won't tell them any different. But yeah, so far kids have taken the other route where they think he gets eaten. So I'll leave it to them.
That's great. Have you been surprised by the just overwhelming success of the?
Yeah, I was surprised when we even sold it as a book, much less that it picked up the way it did. It's just one of those things that I'm not sure you can engineer that kind of thing. And so when it did get picked up with everybody else, it's been crazy to watch how it gets translated. And even in other languages and things, other countries picked it up when I wasn't really sure the tone would translate even outside my circle of friends, like much less to the country and other countries. It's been huge. I never would have guessed. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been great. And the reaction to this one so far has been very good as well. It's been it's a scary thing to put another one out when it was such a random book to begin with. You don't really know what people are expecting, but as soon as we finished this one, I liked it a lot for the second book. I still like it.
I do too. Are you, I know that you've worked on some animated film projects. You worked on Coraline and Kung Fu Panda.
Yeah.
Are you still working on film, or are you doing just?
A little bit. I've been trying to focus on the books as much as possible just because I really like it a lot. But I try and do a little bit of work in animation just to kind of, if you hop back and forth, I think that's good for even just whatever you're working on right then. It helps you analyze just the general rules of books or movies or however that is. So I try and jump back and forth a little bit, but I like thinking of stories on the small scale that these things allow you to. Animation generally has bigger ideas, and not always, but at least with the bigger films it does, and so you're thinking about larger story points, whereas these things are just so great for simple stories. So, and also I find that coming up with book ideas, when you think you have a good story idea, it's meant for one medium, and so you don't really have an idea for a story, you have an idea for a book, or you have an idea for a film, and it's not usually one or the other, and so you really have to focus on that thing. You don't find it crossovers, at least I don't find it crosses over very often.
Do you ever find inspiration from one or the other?
Yeah, all the time. I think that the books, and especially I Want My Hat Back and this one, are largely inspired by just sort of by movies I've watched rather than books I've read, just the way they're paced and everything. I'm not sure that there's not anything to be learned. Like, you can go back and forth between movies and just find out how they're paced. I think that's most of it. And page for page, I'm not sure there's a lot to be learned, but at least how how they pace a movie and how directly when you watch a movie, if they get you into the story right away, you can learn a lot from that, how they do it. And I like to do that with these books just because you don't have a lot of pages, and so you sort of learn how to hit the ground running right away with the story, and you don't have a long prologue, same way as like a really fast movie would have. Yeah.
If there was a book, a picture book out now that, you know, from however long ago, a classic or something more contemporary that you could illustrate, what would that
Again?
what would
Like
that
to do
be?
it again?
Yeah. Or if you just, yeah, exactly, redone in your own style.
Oh, a picture book.
Or any book, really.
I've always liked Rip Van Winkle as a story. I think it's a really visual story because, you know, everything ages and he goes back and they compare the two places from where he was and where he ended up at the end after he slept for a long time. I haven't seen a recent version of it. I think I saw an Arthur Rackham version that's really, really good. But as a picture book, it might make a really neat one. I think I've always wanted to try that out. But yeah, there's some parts in it that aren't necessarily visual, but it's such a beautiful, you know, all the hills and the fall. I think when he's walking around, that would be really pretty. But yeah, I don't know if there's anything I'd want to redo that I really liked, just because the ones I really liked were so much their own thing that I would feel bad going back in. But like old stories like that, I'd love to try it. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite from childhood?
A favorite book?
Yeah, or a picture book that you particularly admire.
My favorite picture book was Sam and the Firefly. It was P.D. Eastman's first book. He did Go Dog Go and a bunch of other ones. And I found out it was his first book he ever did, too, or his first picture book anyway. And I was so jealous when I found that out because it's such a perfectly done thing. And it's actually a very complicated concept to set up that he does to get the book done. And going back to it when I started doing books, I was surprised how simple it was. The illustrations were so simple. They were just these pencil shadings and over teal, and it was very, very suggestive. When I had painted very specific things in there in my memory, I had these whole scenes done out. When I went back, they were just very loose and very suggestive. And his illustrations also, they aren't very stylish. They aren't, he wasn't showing off in his illustrations, and that's one of the things I think I try for a little bit, is that he was very experimental in his books. I think they actually are very complicated things, but the stories, like the words are so simple and the pictures are so simple that you don't notice until you go back and sort of really take a good look at it, what he was doing. But he's taking a lot of chances with the kind of stories he was trying out, and that was a good example of it. And Go Dog Go is another one where it's just like, you don't know what that book is about, but kids love it. And I go through it and I was like, what makes this book work? But the pictures are so simple and the words are so simple that you don't see he's doing anything all that complicated, but he really, really is. Yeah, that was my favorite book, though, growing up. I also like the Frog and Toad books. I think those are perfect. And he's doing so many complicated things emotionally with those two guys, but the words are huge on the page and the illustrations are very simple. But he's getting into a lot of stuff with those books. It's really neat. I like that.
Mm-hmm. That's so true of your style, too, I think.
I try for it. I don't know. It helps to keep it simple, because then at least you don't have to think about anything, or at least you keep it so simple that the actual practice of it, the illustrations are simple, and you do all the work on the front end. So you think about all these things, but the actual illustration isn't all that complicated. It takes a while, but it's not like you're depending on it to carry the book. You've done the thinking before, and so it takes the load off of the illustration part for sure. And
it involves the reader so much too, I think.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Thanks, because I try. I think that you're always trying to find that line between when you're being lazy and when you're actually trying to involve them more. But that distinction between what you can suggest with a character, like the characters in both these books are very simple looking, and they don't show a lot of emotion, but what's going on is very emotional. I think that's something that we just do normally. If you're going through something, you're not often screaming your head off and running around. You're often sitting very still, but you're still going through these things. And so if you can front load that and just put a person just standing there, but you tell the audience that this person's going through something very big, suddenly you work all that stuff into the illustration by themselves. They're putting that in and they're loading that context. And kids are great at that. I think that when I was a kid anyway, you have stuffed animals or whatever, and you're apologizing to them for whatever it is, and you can but they're not moving, and so you're loading everything you know about what they might be feeling into that object or that picture or whatever it is. I'm glad it works for kids. I was wondering whether they would just get bored by how simple the illustrations are, but it seems to be working the other way. Yeah.
Yeah. You've also illustrated for other authors.
Yeah.
And I loved your illustrations in Extra Yarn.
Oh, thank you.
That's one of my favorites. It's like, oh, there's a little cameo appearance.
There is, well, it was sort of an unintentional cameo, that one. There's a bear wearing a sweater, and there is actually a rabbit wearing a sweater. But at the time, it was supposed to be cats and dogs and other animals. That's the text. And I just thought, as like just a general lineup, it would look good if we had cats and dogs, and then something bigger, and then like a little smaller animal, just as a sort of a period to the lineup. And it just ended up being a bear and a rabbit. I honestly didn't think about. I was working on both books at the same time. I don't know why it didn't occur to me. And then later we spent, so long trying to. At least I was doing this thing where I was trying to tell people that, he really did eat the rabbit at the end. That was the idea of the story. And then Extra Yarn came out after I Want My Hat Back, and suddenly it was Rabbit Resurrected, and I was like, oh no, I've confused everybody horribly. But I just say it's a different rabbit. Rabbits look the same. If you see 10 rabbits in a row, they probably look pretty similar. And so the best I can do is say, yeah, I only can draw one kind of animal.
Was that, so you worked on both books simultaneously?
Almost, yeah, at the same time. It was tricky, but it was also really exciting because your technique is learning, I hadn't done tons and tons of picture books at that point, and I still haven't done tons of them, but I was learning what it was to do book illustration specifically. And technically there was differences between the two books, but they were teaching me a lot back and forth, even though it was two very different books. Yeah, It was nice.
And I imagine that whole experience of having someone else's words and you're putting, the illustration in some ways would be easier because it's already laid out for you.
It is easier. There's different things you can solve, but you can hit the ground a lot faster just illustrating. It goes faster, that part. And I really like solving and pacing out. When someone gives you a text, the illustrator gets to sort of, at least most of the time, gets to divide up the pages and figure out where those turns are. For Mac's book, for Extra Yarn, he writes those so well that it was pretty much implied. He didn't write that turn the page here, but I think he knows it when he's writing it. But a lot of times when you do get a text, the most fun part is at the beginning where you're like, well, what is the pace of this, and how should we structure it as a book, just visually and as an arc and all that kind of thing. That's my favorite part of doing those books. And when you're writing your own, you don't get that. You're on your own, and so it is a bit more stressful, that empty part at the beginning. But they have huge advantages. Doing your own stuff, you get to tighten it up both ways as tight as you can get it. And if you get it right, it's the most fun. Yeah, I like that a lot.
So when you started working on This Is Not My Hat, you had pretty big shoes to fill.
We didn't know. I think that at the time, the shoes were getting bigger, but we didn't know how big the shoes were, I guess. But I wanted to get it done earlier on just because either way, I think people's reaction to your thing that's out there right now is going to affect how you're working on it, whether it goes badly or it goes well. And so we were trying to get something that was going to, or at least I was trying to get something that was going to stand on its own, that wasn't going to give too big of a nod to the last book. Like, we didn't want to refer to it overtly, but I like the idea that either way, if you've seen the first book, you'll get a little bit of that in this one. But even if you find it on its own and you hadn't seen the first one, that was the main goal, was to sort of, let's not refer to it too much and make sure this works on its own. And I think it does. I think on its own, it's a very different book, actually, even though the plot is the same almost, or at least the beginning of the plot is the same, and the ending to a certain extent. I think it's actually a very, very different story, and it was so interesting to work on that and to sort of take those same ingredients and see what else we could do. I think it was a really neat exercise.
Mm-hmm. They're very complementary, I think.
I hope so. I mean, at least they're negatives of each other. And that was sort of the idea. I was having trouble figuring out a story for it, and then Anne, my art director at Candlewick, was saying, we should just go somewhere else, just try a different setting and different characters. And so we just flopped it. Like, you just turn the book on its side, and now it's light things on dark rather than dark things on light, and a thief instead of someone who got robbed. Yeah.
Do you have more books that you're working on right now? Do you have something else?
I'm working on the next one for Candlewick, the next book in whatever this is. I think it's a series, I'm not sure. But whatever it is, I'm working on the next one for that. And then also the guy who wrote Extra Yarn, Mac Barnett, he's written another one. And I'll start working on that. I've already sort of started, but I'll start working on that once this book is done.
Are there any authors that you would particularly love to illustrate?
Oh boy.
That you haven't worked with?
I always read a lot of older books. Like, I never had a lot of newer books around, and so all my favorites and people I would dream to work with are probably dead. I never had William Steig when I was growing up, and I've since discovered him since I got into books a bit more, and he's just, if anyone ever found a lost thing, and I won the lottery, but I can't really think of anybody else. I've been really lucky to get to work with. I've worked with Ted Kruser to do House Held Up by Trees, and that was an amazing text to get, and Mac is such a visual writer. He writes just beautifully for illustrations. I think I've been pretty lucky so far. I'm not sure I want to jinx it.
Yeah, that's understandable. Do you have a preferred form of procrastination?
Showering. I take showers until the hot water is gone. I don't know why. I like being in warm water. I don't know whether it gives me ideas or not. Some people say they think in the shower. I think I try, but I just enjoy showering too much. I just stand there. Sleeping too. Showering and sleeping. Those are things I like to do if I don't want to do anything else.
Mm-hmm. If you're trying to sort of avoid work.
Very home-based things. Nothing that takes too much energy.
I have heard that from other authors, though. The shower.
The shower?
Is like or they come up with
yeah,
ideas.
it's kind of a good refuge. No one bothers you anyway. And yeah, at least you're clean when you're done.
Maybe that's part of it.
Yeah, it's at least you're sort of multitasking, even though you're really not.
Exactly. That's pretty good. Do you have a prized possession?
A prized possession. I have a goose that I bought, a stuffed goose. It's not a real goose. It's like a felt goose, and I got it from this guy who does Russian. He's Russian, but he does these very Russian-looking animals, and they're about this big. And we got him to commission a bear and a rabbit from the book. But this goose I bought long before that, and it's just this beautiful thing. And I've often said that if there was a fire, I'd have to, if we saw the cat and the goose, we have a real cat, and I would have to choose between the cat and the goose, I'd have a hard time. I love that goose so much. He's just a very endearing goose. I like him. That's probably a prized possession.
That's great. Do you think you'll ever do an illustration or create a book around the goose?
I don't know. He's almost too good to make a story for. He's so good on his own. But yeah, someday if I feel bold enough, I'll try it.
A goose with a hat?
Yeah, a goose with a hat, or even without, just him hanging out by himself. I have too many story ideas that just involve characters I like just looking at each other, and there's nothing more than that. You can't put them out as books, but they're nice to look at.
Do you kind of keep a file or something, or do you just keep them in your head?
I used to, although I've found that my favorite story ideas come in the middle of the night. They just come really fast, and the ones I tend to work on and sort of hold in a drawer, they end up getting overworked and overthought to the point where I don't like them much anymore. But both of these books have been sort of surprises in like an evening when I was just doing something else. Yeah, so you try and keep an eye open for both those things, but it doesn't hurt to keep a file. Mm-hmm. I think small pieces come into the other ones, but yeah, so far I haven't had any good luck with things I've kept and held on to for a long time.
So do you come up with your middle of the night inspiration? Is that more of a visual inspiration where you sketch really quick, or is it more?
It has to be both. I've found for these books at least, it has to be both. I write them in text first, but you always write them with parentheses saying this is happening in the picture. I'm not as experienced a writer, and so I need the pictures to be doing most of the legwork. But I found that if I know I have a good idea for a book, it's because I like reading it to people first, even without the pictures. You can explain what's going on, but you have to enjoy reading it through. But I think, yeah, it has to count on the pictures. I'm not sure that a good picture book can just happen to have illustrations. You need them to be doing, at least meeting the text halfway. If you just sort of have it to make a thing pretty, I'm not sure I would enjoy illustrating something like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, can you share with us any more about your new book?
No, I can't actually. It's still very much, it's one of those things, picture books are so small in terms of the scale of them. The greatest part about it is that you can change at any minute and change your decision and go off and change the whole story, but it takes 5 minutes to change a story in the writing stage. And so, but that's the worst part about it too, is that up to the last minute you have total freedom to just completely change your book. And so I'm still at the stage where that's happening all the time, and it's a great thing because it's not like a movie where you have this giant boat to steer. It's a quick little skiff, but at the same time it can get exhausting, but it can move that fast all the time, and you're trying to hold it in. So right now it's still darting around, and I haven't quite found the path yet.
Mm-hmm. You want to work on it a little, kind of the way that you did the first time around? Yeah,
I think that at least in my experience so far, like I say, it's one of those things where if it doesn't come almost as quick as you would read it, then it's not quite as tight an idea. And both of these have been written almost as fast as you read them now. And it's like, that's when you know that's when you get really excited and nervous when you're writing. So I think I have it now. But if you're like, oh, well, I have this one, I have the first page, and you sit in the first page for 2 weeks, then probably isn't going to happen. Yeah. But it's an interesting thing to find out how these things are done, at least for me. I'm not sure how everyone else does it, but that's been my process. It's just sort of, you wait to get hit with a truck, I guess.
Well, it seems to be working pretty well for
So
you.
far, so good. Yeah, it's just, you want a couple more trucks.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Great. Well, we'll take a look at what you've got.
I've done a very complicated
Going
drawing. It took a long time, but it's the turtle from the first book and the crab from the other. And I guess they could be underwater, because turtles can do that, but they could also be above water, because crabs can do that. So I'll leave that to the reader's imagination.
I love that combo of the
Yeah, these two
I want
guys.
my
I think
hat
they
back
could
and-
probably, neither of them, well, the crab doesn't say anything and the turtle doesn't say much, but they could hang out, I suppose.
They look like they want to have a conversation.
Yeah, they might have something to say. They're not looking at each other, but maybe they will.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming.
No, thank
It's
you for having
really,
me. This is
really
great.
nice to meet you.
Thank you so much.